In the low wooden chamber, the first light of morning slipped through the narrow cracks of a shutter worn with dust, leaving broken shafts of pale brightness upon the hardened earthen floor. The air was damp and cool, heavy with the smell of old flax hung too long, mingling with the faint odor of smoke from a hearth long since faded. Upon the great loom, which filled almost the entire space, sat the weaver, back bent as though she had grown into the wood itself. Her hair, streaked with gray, was bound in a frayed cloth. Those stray wisps fell across the furrows of her brow. The loom groaned softly as her feet pressed against the worn treadles. Each touch set the ancient frame to trembling, and the sound that followed was slow and steady. The creak of wood, the swift passage of the shuttle, the firm strike of the beater as it pressed the weft into place. Again and again, a heartbeat carved in wood. In this chamber, time itself seemed bound to that rhythm, drawn out and measured by the crossing of threads. Beyond the door, the wind moved faintly across the thatched roof, and somewhere down the lane a cock crowed too late. Children's laughter drifted, carried from the muddy path that wound between huts. Yet here, within the narrow confines of the room, there was only the endless repetition, the shuttle gliding, the wood clapping, the loom breathing its ancient breath. The weaver's hands, dry and calloused, moved without haste but without error. Each finger felt the drawn threads, judging their tautness, their straightness. Her eyes, clouded with age yet sharpened by long habit, caught every imperfection, no matter how small. Sight had dimmed, but the memory of cloth was burned too deep to fade. Every morning, as the bell of the distant church gave its first toll, she took her seat. A crust of bread eaten quickly, a swallow of cold water, and the labor began. She did not measure her life by sun or moon, nor even by the changing of the seasons. Her calendar was woven into bolts of cloth, the length of linen completed in a day. The emptying of the chest where the hanks of flax were stored, the growth of piles that leaned silently against the wall. Sometimes she paused, listening. Bell would sound again, solemn and distant, spreading its vibrations across the misty air. That echo entered the chamber and settled itself into the rhythm of the loom. How many times had she heard it? She no longer knew. Each toll was both familiar and strange, as if reminding her that every life was a thread. Drawn tight and bound into the vast fabric that no eye could see, the morning wore itself away. Its light shifting in shade, from golden pale to the dull whiteness of noon. Dust motes and fragments of fiber floated through the air, caught and spun within the beams of light, turning lazily in invisible currents. The weaver did not speak, for there was no one to hear, and her hands continued their endless pattern. At times she closed her eyes, and still the work went on. For her body and the loom had become one and the same. When the sun climbed higher, she rose at last. Her steps, slow and careful, took her to the yard beyond the door, where a clay vessel of water stood beneath the eaves. She bent, gazing faintly at her own reflection wavering in the dark surface, the face aged and lined, marked with silence. With a ladle, she drew the water, drinking in small sips, letting the cold trace its way through her throat. From across the fields came the scent of young grain, mixed with the drifting smoke of some neighbor's fire. For a moment, children's cries reached her ears again, yet thin and fleeting, soon absorbed into the great stillness of the noontide. She turned, and with the same weary pace returned to the chamber, where the loom waited with its rigid frame. Within the dim light, the shuttle resumed its flight, the threads there, endless crossing. The fabric that gathered on the beam bore no pattern but its own simplicity. Plain cloth, coarse and strong, meant for the covering of bodies, for wrapping, for bags and bedding. There was no beauty in it, yet within the plainness lay the breath of living days captured in each strand. Her thoughts wandered at times. In the echo of the wood she recalled the days of youth, when her arms were stronger, when the chamber held another presence. She remembered her husband's figure once beside her at the loom, his laughter beneath the smoke of the oil lamp. But he was long gone, and only the frame of wood remained to answer her solitude. The loom had taken the place of all voices. Striking its measure in place of conversation, time stretched like thread across the shuttle's flight. without ending and without haste. The afternoon light slanted, long and yellow, crossing through the slats of the shutter and laying bars across the floor. Against the wall, bolts of cloth leaned in silence, rolled and bound. Her garment clung damp with sweat, but her hands did not cease. At last the church bell tolled again, slower, heavier, the sound of evening prayer. She rested her weary limbs, running her palms slowly across the ridges of her fingers, where the flax had cut its thin lines again and again. After a long pause, she reached into a wooden chest and drew out a hardened loaf, breaking it in silence, chewing each bite with patience. Outside, the sky darkened into a color of ashes. Birds passed overhead, their shadows crossing the narrow window to fall briefly upon the unfinished cloth. The weaver lifted her gaze, eyes following those fleeting shapes, but soon returned again to her place, bound to the rhythm as though no other path could remain to her. Night descended without hurry. She lit a candle, its small flame trembling against the drafts that moved through the thatch. Its glow spread weakly upon the cloth, quivering like water, and in that flickering light the loom continued. Now its voice mingled with other sounds, the murmur of wind through reeds, the barking of a dog far off, the occasional cry of an owl drifting from the forest edge. The weaver marked no calendar, counted no days. To her there was only thread and cloth, shuttle and beater, the slow weaving of existence. Each strike of the wood pressed not only fiber, but also the moments of her life into the fabric, binding silence with silence. She knew herself as no more than a single filament within the vast unseen tapestry of the world, yet still she labored, for there was no other way to breathe, to endure, to remain. The candle burned lower, leaving a thread of smoke that curled upward to the rafters. Its light dimmed upon her face, and shadows gathered until her features melted into the darkness. Yet the sound of the loom remained, steady, unchanging. The voice of wood and thread, the voice of time itself. Weaving the long night without end, the night lingered, heavy and unbroken, as the candle's glow waned into darkness. The loom stood silent at last, its frame looming like the ribs of some vast creature resting in slumber. The weaver had folded herself upon a narrow cot against the wall, her breath shallow and even, her hands curled as though still clutching the thread. Dreams came not as visions, but as continuations of labor in her sleep. She still heard the treadle creak, the shuttle pass, the beater strike. Time had no boundary there, stretched seamless as the cloth upon the loom. When dawn returned, it did so quietly, spilling thin rays of gray light across the chamber. The air was cold, damp with the dew that seeped through the thatch. A rooster crowed once more, though fainter than the one before. Somewhere a dog barked, breaking the stillness. Then silence settled again. The weaver stirred, rising stiffly, limbs slow, as though reluctant to depart the rest of night. She bent to splash water from a small basin upon her face, the chill rousing her into wakefulness. From a clay vessel, she drew another cup, drinking the cold liquid with careful sips. There was no feast, no variety. A piece of bread, broken and chewed without haste. And she returned to the great wooden frame that awaited her as faithfully as shadow follows the body. Her foot pressed the treadle, and once more the loom awakened. The sound was always the same, yet never tiring, never finished. Creak, glide, strike, creak, glide, strike. Knew any other ear it might have been monotonous, but to her it was life's only true measure, a rhythm more constant than the heart. The shuttle darted, the warp opened, the weft settled, the beater came down. Over and over, until thought dissolved and only motion remained. Outside, the village moved in its own rhythm. Wheels turned on the road as carts passed, their wooden rims grinding against stones. Voices called faintly from one house to another. A child's cry rose, sharp and quick, before fading. A hammer struck from some distant smithy, echoing like a bell. All these sounds drifted faintly into the chamber, yet none disturbed the weaver's attention. They passed as shadows upon water, fleeting and ungrasped, while the loom's cadence endured, anchoring her to the steady flow of time. By mid-morning, fibers of flax clung to her garments, speckled her hair, lodged themselves in the lines of her hands. She brushed them not away, for they had long become part of her. The fabric on the beam grew heavier, its roll thick and unbending, yet her limbs bore the weight without complaint. Her breath matched the rhythm, a slow exhale with the treadle. An intake as the shuttle darted, a pause as the beater fell. Work and body merged into a single harmony until she seemed less a person than a vessel for weaving itself. Occasionally her gaze lifted to the shutter's crack, watching the slant of light. She marked no hours, but she knew by instinct when the bell would toll. And so it came, distant and sonorous, spreading across the air with its solemn vibration. The sound lingered upon the threads, seemed to bind itself into the cloth. She closed her eyes briefly, bowing her head, though no words passed her lips. Prayer for her was not voice, but labor, and each strike of the beater carried its own unspoken devotion. At length she rose once more, stretching her cramped limbs. From a corner she drew a sack, and within it, small dried peas, hard and wrinkled with age. She placed a handful into a pot, filled it with water from the jug, and set it upon the hearth. A small fire, coaxed from twigs and embers, crackled faintly, sending smoke into the rafters. The scent of peas softening and water filled the chamber. She sat by the flame, turning the pot now and again, her gaze unfocused. As though listening to a voice beyond hearing, the meal was simple: peas boiled to softness, a crust of bread dipped within the broth. She ate with care, chewing slowly, as though to prolong each mouthful. When finished, she set aside the vessel, wiped her hands upon a cloth, and returned again to her station. The afternoon deepened. Clouds gathered beyond the roof, casting dim shadows across the room. Light waned, but the weaver's motion remained steady. Her thoughts wandered once more into memory, of her mother's hands, teaching her the art of thread, showing her how to draw the shuttle without tangling, how to beat the weft firm. She remembered her mother's voice, hushed and low, warning that the loom demanded patience that had taught endurance more than skill. Those lessons had never left her. The loom had shaped her days, her years, her very being, until she could not imagine herself apart from it. The bell rang again as evening neared. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow. The cloth was long now, rolled thick upon the beam, its surface smooth beneath her palm. She touched it with a strange tenderness, as though it were not fabric, but memory given form. Into it were pressed countless hours, countless breaths, each beat of the loom a fragment of her existence. She thought, perhaps when another took this cloth, they would not see her, would not know her name. Yet some trace of her would remain silent, but enduring, bound into every thread. As dusk approached, she gathered the woven roll, binding it with rough cord, and set it beside others leaning against the wall. The chamber grew darker, shadows lengthening across the floor. From outside came the distant sounds of villagers returning, their footsteps upon the path, their low voices rising and falling like waves. A dog barked once, then again, and was silent. She lit another candle, its flame trembling. Once more the loom sang beneath her hands, though slower now. Its rhythm softened with the weariness of the day. The sound mingled with the chirping of crickets beyond the walls, with the sighing of wind across the eaves. The night came down in layers, enfolding her within its stillness, when at last she ceased. She sat long in silence, watching the flame bend and sway. Her eyes traced the threads upon the loom, half finished, awaiting tomorrow. She thought not of ending, only of continuation, for the work was never truly done. She drew the blanket about her shoulders, sat a moment more, and finally lay upon her narrow bed, the loom's shadow stretching over her, as though it too had settled into rest. The candle burned low, smoke rose thinly into the rafters. Darkness covered the chamber once again. Yet even in silence the rhythm lingered, not in wood or thread, but in the heart that beat on, awaiting the dawn. The dawn returned once more, soft and reluctant, spreading pale light through the mist that clung to the thatched roof. Drops of dew beaded upon the rough shutters, sliding down in slow trails that caught the first brightness of morning. Within the chamber, the air was thick and still, touched with the faint smell of ashes from the hearth, the musk of old wool, and the sourness of dampened earth. The loom waited, silent but immense. Like a monument to endless labor, the weaver rose from her cot with care, her limbs stiff as though each joint were carved from wood. She rubbed her eyes, then her hands, tracing the lines cut deep by thread and toil. No word escaped her lips. She moved in silence as she always had, to the basin where water sat cold and unmoving. She washed, the chill biting her skin, and drank from the clay cup, savoring the plain clarity of it. Bread, dry and hard, was broken with her teeth. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and let the taste fade without complaint. She seated herself once more before the great frame. The loom greeted her with stillness, but in her ears its sound was already alive, waiting to resume. Wrote. She pressed the treadle, and it awoke. The old wood groaned, the threads parted, the shuttle flew, the beater fell. Creak, glide, strike. Creak, glide, strike. The rhythm rejoined her breath, her heartbeat, her very being. The morning stretched. Outside, the village stirred. It sounds faint and distant. A woman's voice calling her children. The cry of a pig driven from its pen, the thud of a door closing. Yet none of these pierced the weaver's world. To her there was only the measured song of the loom, rising of the cloth upon the beam, the growing weight that pressed against the frame. She did not think of end or beginning. There was only continuation, as natural and unbroken as the flow of water in the river beyond the fields. Light deepened, casting thin shafts through the cracks of the shutters. Within those beams, dust and fragments of flax drifted like wandering stars, turning in circles unseen. They clung to her skin, her garments, her hair, yet she brushed them away no more than she would brush away her own breath. She belonged to them as they belonged to her. Hours passed. The church bell rang, its tone heavy and solemn, reaching even into the dim chamber. She bowed her head slightly, but no word followed, where prayer was already woven into every strike, every line of thread drawn tight. She needed no voice to carry her devotion. The loom was her altar, the cloth her offering, the silence her hymn. By midday her body ached, though she did not falter. Her arms moved as though of their own accord, the shuttle darting swift and sure, the beater falling with unfailing measure. At last she paused, setting aside her work to tend to the small pot upon the hearth. She lit the fire, coaxing it to life with dry twigs, and poured in lentils from a rough sack. Water hissed as it met the vessel's blackened sides, filling the air with steam that curled like ghostly fingers into the rafters. She sat as it simmered, watching the thin bubbles rise and break. Her eyes were heavy, but her gaze was steady, her breath slow. When at last the lentils softened, she dipped her bread into the broth. Chewing without haste, her face blank, her body still, she finished, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and returned. The afternoon waned. Clouds moved across the sky, dimming the light. Loom's rhythm continued unbroken, steady as rainfall upon a roof. At times her mind wandered too. Memories unbidden, her father's face, stern and silent, teaching her as a child to spin flax into thread. Her mother's hands, guiding hers upon the shuttle. Da 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 da. Want, oh, war, what, as, by wind, by well, by one up, by. Each memory came and went like a shadow cast by passing clouds, leaving no trace but the faint ache of remembrance. Evening drew near. The church bell tolled again, slower echoing through the thickening air. She straightened, easing her weary limbs. Her eyes lingered upon the growing bolt of cloth, its surface smooth and pale. She ran her hand across it, feeling its firmness, its coolness, its silent endurance. Into this length of fabric she had pressed hours beyond counting, and still more would follow. Perhaps others would wear it. Perhaps it would cover beds or wrap goods for market. It would not know her name, would not think of the hands that had formed it. Yet still, some part of her lived there, hidden, silent, enduring. Darkness fell slowly, stretching shadows across the floor until the chamber was shrouded. She lit the candle, its flame flickering weakly, pushing back the dark only by a hand's breadth. She worked on, though slower, her arms heavy, her breath shallow. The sound of the loom mingled with the whisper of wind, with the faint call of an owl, with the distant bark of a dog. When at last her strength waned, she laid aside the shuttle. She sat long in silence, staring at the trembling flame. Her face was unreadable, her eyes fixed upon the threads half-woven. She did not think of tomorrow, nor of yesterday. She thought only of the work still to be done, of the cloth still to grow. At length she drew the blanket about her shoulders and returned to the cot. She lay down, her eyes closing slowly. The loom loomed above her in the dark, its frame casting a shadow that stretched across her bed as though even in sleep she could not escape its presence. The candle dwindled. Smoke rose faintly into the rafters. The chamber sank into silence once again, save for the faint breath of the weaver, slow and steady. In that silence, the loom seemed still alive, waiting, patient, eternal. The night loosened its hold slowly, as though reluctant to release the chamber into dawn. Darkness lingered, gray and heavy, until the faintest glimmer crept between the shutters, thin as a thread drawn from the loom itself. The air was chill, damp with the breath of the fields outside, and within it carried the mingled sense of smoke gone cold, of flax lingering in bundles, of wool stored in shadows. The loom loomed silent, vast and patient, its frame standing. In the half-light, like a darkened tree with limbs stretched wide, the weaver stirred upon her cot, her body stiffened by age and labor. She rose with effort, her joints groaning faintly as though they echoed the creak of the loom itself. For a moment she sat, still as stone, her hands resting upon her knees, her breath shallow and even. Then, with slow precision, she reached for the basin, splashing water upon her face, letting the cold sting her into wakefulness. Her reflection, blurred and shifting, looked back at her from the dark surface of the basin, lined, sunken, pale. That held no surprise. She broke bread with her teeth, chewing until it softened, swallowing with patience. But the taste was bland without bitterness, without sweetness. She drank water from the clay cup, cool and pure, and set it aside. Her eyes, though clouded, turned already toward the loom, as though drawn there by instinct older than thought. When her feet pressed the treadles, the great frame awoke once more. The chamber filled with its song, the creak of wood, the rush of shuttle, the strike of beater, again and again, as steady as the tolling of the church bell, as constant as the beating of the heart. The fabric grew, inch by inch, breath by breath. Outside, the village came alive. Carts rumbled upon the earthen paths, their wheels grinding against stones. Voices drifted faintly through the morning mist, a woman calling her child, a man urging oxen forward, the distant barking of a dog. Yet these sounds were fleeting, dissolved into silence before they reached her fully. To her, the only voice that mattered was the loom, and it spoke without end. The morning deepened. Beams of light slanted through the shutters, cutting bright. Lines across the floor, then those shafts, dust and threads floated, suspended like stars in the firmament, drifting in circles too slow for the eye to follow. The weaver's body moved steadily, her arms guiding the shuttle, her foot pressing the treadle, her breath keeping pace. Each motion bore the weight of repetition, yet none faltered, none erred. She had become less a woman than an instrument. Of weaving, her soul poured into the endless task. At length, the bell of the church tolled, distant and solemn. The sound rolled across the fields, entered the chamber, and lingered among the threads. She bowed her head slightly, but no word left her lips. Her prayer was already given, each strike of the beater, each line of thread laid firm. For her, the loom was church, and the cloth was scripture. and silence itself was worship. She paused briefly, rising from her seat. Her steps, slow and deliberate, carried her to the hearth. There she gathered a few twigs, coaxing flame from embers long. Asleep. Smoke rose, curling into the dim rafters. She poured a measure of dried barley into a pot, filled it with water, and set it upon the fire. The scent of earth and grain filled the room as steam curled upward, soft and fragrant. She sat by the flame, her gaze steady, her body still. When the barley softened, she ate, spooning the plain porridge into her mouth, chewing slowly, swallowing without haste. It was not pleasure she sought, only sustenance, only continuation. When the pot was empty, she rinsed it with a little water, set it aside, and returned to her station. The loom welcomed her once more, and the rhythm resumed, steady and unbroken. Afternoon drew on. Clouds gathered outside, dimming the light within. The chamber grew darker, though still the loom's cadence echoed, creak, glide, strike. At times, her eyes closed, her body moving of its own accord. She could have woven blind, for the motions were carved into her bones. Memory and instinct guided her, more sure than sight. As the day lengthened, her thoughts wandered unbidden. She remembered the faces of those long gone, her mother's gentle patience, her father's stern instruction, her husband's laughter, brief and warm. She remembered the cries of children, now grown or gone, the sound of their small feet upon the floor, the way they had peered curiously at the loom. All of it faded into silence, leaving only the endless rhythm. Yet even in absence, their shadows seemed woven into the threads, as though the cloth carried not only flax and wool, but memory itself. The bell tolled again, its sound heavy with the weight of evening. The weaver lifted her head, gazing upon the cloth that had grown long and strong upon the beam. She touched it lightly, her fingers tracing its surface. Each inch was a fragment of her life, pressed into form. Others would never know her hands had shaped it. They would see only fabric, plain and serviceable. Yet within it dwelt the hours of her breath, the measure of her days, the devotion of her silence. Dusk settled, shadows stretching across the floor. She gathered the cloth, binding it with cord, setting it aside with others leaning in quiet rows. Their weight pressed against the wall, mute and enduring, testimony to years uncounted. She lit a candle, its flame trembling weakly, pushing back the dark only a little. Still she worked, though her arms ached, though her back bent low. Outside, the world grew still. Birds gave their final calls, and the air grew colder, heavier with dew. Within, the loom spoke on. Its voice joined now with the faint chirp of insects, the sigh of wind through the thatch. The candle flickered, throwing shadows that leaped across the walls like restless spirits. At last, her strength waned. She set the shuttle aside, resting her hands upon her knees. Her eyes lingered upon the unfinished cloth half-born, awaiting the morrow. She sat long in silence, her gaze fixed, her thoughts unreadable. Then, with slow care, she drew the blanket about her shoulders, lay once more upon the cot, and closed her eyes. The candle dwindled, its flame shrinking to a pin of light. Smoke rose, faint and wavering. Darkness gathered, folding the chamber into itself. Yet even as silence fell, the rhythm lingered, unseen, unbroken, waiting for the dawn to call it forth again. The night retreated with hesitation, as though reluctant to abandon the earth today. Darkness thinned, turning from black to gray, until the faint pallor of dawn crept across the shutters. The chamber stirred not at first. The loom stood still, silent as a sentinel. Its shadow stretched across the floor. Then, at length, the weaver stirred upon her narrow cot. Her breath drew deep, her limbs stiffened, her bones groaned as though answering the creak of the old wooden frame. She sat, bent and still, hands upon her knees, waiting for her body to obey her will. The air was chill, damp with the breath of fields soaked in dew. She rose slowly, each movement deliberate, careful, heavy with years. At the basin she washed, splashing water upon her face, letting the cold seep into her skin. waking her with its sharp bite. She drank steady and slow from the clay cup. Her reflection wavered in the water, lines deep and eyes dim, yet she regarded it without surprise, without judgment. She broke a piece of hard bread, chewed until it softened, swallowed, and set. The rest aside, the morning had begun. She turned, and her gaze fell upon the loom. Vast, dark, and patient, it waited. She moved to it without thought, for her body knew no other path. Her feet pressed the treadles, and the silence was broken. Creak, glide, strike, shuttle darted, the threads parted, the beater fell. Again and again, steady, unchanging, eternal. The room filled with its cadence, the same as yesterday, the same as years long past, the same as years yet to come. Outside, the village stirred with its own rhythms. Voices rose faintly across the mist, a man calling to oxen, a child crying, the bark of a dog, the toll of a door closing. Carts rumbled along the paths, their wheels grinding against stones. Yet these sounds passed like shadows upon water, brief and fleeting. Within the chamber, only the loom's voice endured, unbroken and unyielding. The morning deepened. Light pierced the shutters, falling in long, narrow beams across the floor. Dust and threads hung in the air, drifting like stars in a night sky, slow and weightless. They clung to her garments, her hair, her hands, but she brushed them not away. They belonged to her as she belonged to them. Her arms moved without falter, her breath in rhythm, her body bound to the motion. She could have woven blind, for the work was carved into her bones, older than thought, deeper than memory. The church bell tolled, solemn and low. Its sound rolled across the fields, through the air, into the chamber. She bowed her head slightly, but no prayer left her lips. Her devotion was already given, pressed into each line of thread, each strike of the beater. The loom was her altar, the cloth her scripture, the silence her song. Hours passed, though she counted them not. At length she rose, her body heavy, her back bent. She gathered kindling, coaxed flame from the ashes, poured lentils into the pot, filled it with water. The fire hissed, smoke curled into the rafters, the scent of earth and grain filled the air. She sat by the hearth, watching the pot simmer, the steam rising like a ghost of breath. She ate when it was done, slowly, without haste, dipping bread into broth, swallowing with patience. There was no joy, no sorrow, only continuation. She rinsed the pot, set it aside, and returned to the loom. The rhythm resumed, steady, tireless. Outside, the day dimmed. Clouds gathered, the light waned. Within, the loom sang on, unbroken. She thought of little, yet memories wandered across her mind like drifting clouds. She saw her mother's hands, guiding her young fingers upon the shuttle. She heard her father's voice, stern but certain, teaching her to spin flax. She remembered laughter, brief and distant, of her husband once beside her. She remembered the cries of children, the patter of their feet upon the floor. Faded into silence, leaving only the rhythm. Yet she felt their presence still, as though woven into the cloth itself, hidden within its threads. The bell tolled again, evening drawing near. She lifted her eyes, gazing upon the cloth growing thick upon the beam. She touched it lightly, tracing its surface with her fingers. It was plain, without pattern, yet strong, enduring. Within it were bound the hours of her life, pressed into form. Others would use it without knowing, without remembering. They would not see her hands in it, nor hear her silence. Yet still, she remained there, unseen, unspoken, eternal. Dusk fell, shadows lengthening across the chamber. She gathered the finished cloth, binding it with cord, setting it with others against the wall. They leaned in silent rows, mute testimony to years uncounted, their weight pressing against the stones. She lit a candle, its flame weak and trembling, casting more shadow than light. She returned once more to her seat, though her arms ached, though her back bent low. The loom answered her still, its cadence steady, its song unyielding. Outside, the village hushed. Birds called their final notes. The air grew heavy with dew. The world dimmed into silence. Within, the loom continued, its voice joined by the chirping of crickets, The sigh of wind, the faint cry of an owl. The candle flickered, shadows leaping across the walls like restless spirits. At last her strength waned. She laid the shuttle aside, rested her hands upon her knees. She sat long in silence, her eyes fixed upon the half-woven threads. She thought not of tomorrow, nor of yesterday, only of continuation. The loom would wait. The cloth would grow. Her life was no more than the weaving of thread into silence. She drew the blanket about her shoulders, lay upon the cot, closed her eyes. The loom's shadow stretched across her as though guarding her sleep. The candle burned low, then out, leaving only smoke rising into the rafters. Darkness folded the chamber, deep and silent. Yet still, in the stillness, the rhythm lingered, unseen, unbroken, waiting for dawn. The night was long, heavy, and filled with silence, as though the world itself held its breath. In the darkness, the chamber seemed endless, its corners fading into obscurity, its roof beams merging with shadow. The loom stood at the heart of it, black and motionless, yet filled with presence, as though it were alive even in stillness. Its frame rose like the skeleton of some ancient tree, its limbs stretching into the gloom. Its strings taut, as though waiting for the return of sound. Upon her narrow cot, the weaver lay curled beneath her rough blanket. Her breathing was slow, shallow, steady. Even in sleep, her hands twitched faintly, as if they remembered the shuttle and the beater, as if the work never truly ceased. Dreams came not as visions, but as continuations of waking labor. In her mind, the threads parted, the shuttle passed, the beater fell, and cloth grew endlessly, yard upon yard, without ever reaching an end. The loom lived in her, even as she rested, inseparable from her very being. When dawn crept at last across the earth, it did so quietly, as if reluctant to disturb the silence. The shutters glowed faintly, thin lines of gray-white leaking through their cracks. The dew outside clung to thatch and grass, and the air was heavy with dampness, carrying the faint scent of soil and wet leaves. A rooster crowed in the distance, its cry muffled by fog. Slowly, the chamber stirred. The weaver opened her eyes. She lay still at first, listening, though there was nothing to hear but the faint drip of water from the eaves outside. The creak of wood as the walls settled, the sigh of her own breath. She rose with care, her body stiff, her bones aching as if each carried the weight of years. She sat upon the edge of the cot, her hands folded upon her lap, and for a time she did not move. Only when the cold began to bite into her skin did she stir again. At the basin she washed her face, splashing water across her lined cheeks, letting the chill sink into her flesh. The water was bitterly cold, but it cleared her eyes, sharpened her breath. She drank a cup, slow and steady, before breaking a piece of bread and chewing until it softened in her mouth. There was no hunger, only need. She ate to continue as she wove to continue, as she lived to continue. When her hands were free, she turned, and her eyes fell upon the loom. Dark and vast it filled the chamber, waiting. She moved toward it, each step slow, deliberate, as though she approached not wood and thread but something more, an altar, a shrine, a presence greater than herself. She sat upon the stool, placed her feet upon the treadles, and pressed. The silence broke. The loom awoke, creak, glide, strike. The frame trembled with motion, the threads parted, the shuttle flew, the beater fell. Again and again, steady, unchanging. Eternal, the chamber filled with its voice, the rhythm that had measured her days beyond counting. The cloth upon the beam grew thicker, heavier, rolling slowly as each line of thread was pressed into place. Outside, the fog lay heavy upon the fields. Figures moved faintly, blurred shapes carrying water, driving animals, calling to one another in muffled tones. The village stirred, but its sounds were hushed, absorbed by the mist. To the weaver, they reached only as distant murmurs, shadows of sound that passed and were forgotten. Within the chamber, only the loom's cadence endured, unbroken. The morning light strengthened, though it remained pale, filtered through the gray veil. It slipped through the shutters, striking across the floor in thin beams, catching upon floating dust and fragments of flax. They drifted like tiny stars, circling slowly, in unseen currents, descending and rising in endless dance. The weaver's arms moved among them, her hands guiding the shuttle, her feet pressing the treadles, her breath steady and slow. She could have worked blind, for the motions were deeper than sight. They were carved into her bones, older than memory, beyond forgetting. The church bell tolled, distant but clear, its sound carrying across fields and mist. It entered the chamber, vibrating within the wooden frame of the loom. The weaver bowed her head slightly, though no words passed her lips. Her prayer was already given, each strike of the beater, each line of thread. Her devotion was not spoken but woven, silent yet unceasing. The loom was her cathedral, the cloth her scripture, the silence her chant. Hours passed. The weaver's body ached, but she did not falter. Earth matched the rhythm, her heartbeat kept its measure. At last she rose, leaving the loom for a time. She gathered kindling, coaxed flame from the hearth's cold ashes, fed it with twigs until smoke curled upward. She poured barley into the blackened pot, added water, and set it upon the flame. The scent of grain filled the chamber, warm and earthy. She sat by the fire, her eyes steady, her body still, waiting as the water boiled, as the barley softened. She ate slowly, spoon by spoon, chewing with patience. When it was gone, she set the pot aside, rinsed it with water, and returned to the loom. The rhythm resumed, steady, unyielding. The afternoon waned. Shadows lengthened, clouds drifted across the sky, dimming the light. The chamber darkened, but the loom song continued. At times her eyes closed, yet her body moved still, guided by memory, by instinct. By the rhythm that had long replaced thought, her mind wandered. She remembered her mother's hands, teaching her as a child, guiding. Her fingers upon the shuttle. She remembered her father's stern gaze, instructing her to spin flax with patience. She remembered her husband's laughter, his presence beside her at the loom, brief and warm. She remembered children, small feet upon the floor, curious eyes, peering at the frame. All of it was gone, but the memory lingered, faint as the scent of smoke after fire, and still she wove. The bell tolled again, deep and heavy, evening drawing near. She lifted her head, gazing upon the cloth upon the beam. It was thick now, its roll pressing against the frame. She touched it lightly, her fingers tracing its surface. Plain, unadorned, without pattern, yet strong, enduring, a record of her hours, her days, her life. Others would not see her in it, would not know her hands, her silence, her devotion. Yet still she remained there, hidden within the threads, unseen but eternal. Dusk fell, shadows deepened. She gathered the cloth, bound it with cord, placed it among the others leaning against the wall. They stood in silent ranks, heavy and mute. Testimony 2 years without number. She lit a candle, its flame trembling in the draught, casting long shadows across the chamber. She returned to her seat, though her arms trembled, though her back bent low. The loom answered her still, its cadence, steady, unbroken. Outside, the village quieted. Voices faded, footsteps ceased, smoke rose faintly from hearths. Birds gave their final calls, and the air grew heavy with dew. Within, the loom continued, its voice joined by crickets, by the sigh of wind, by the faint cry of an owl. The candle flickered, shadows leaping across the walls like restless spirits. At last her strength gave way. She laid aside the shuttle, rested her hands upon her knees, her breath heavy. She sat long, eyes upon the half-woven cloth. She thought not of tomorrow, nor of yesterday, only of continuation. The loom would wait, the cloth would grow. Her life was no more than thread drawn into silence. She drew her blanket about her shoulders, lay upon her cot, closed her eyes. The loom's shadow stretched across her bed, vast and patient. The candle dwindled, smoke rising thinly into the rafters. Darkness closed upon the chamber, silent and deep. Yet still, in that silence, the rhythm endured, unseen, eternal, waiting. for dawn to summon it again, the night yielded slowly, clinging to earth and sky as though unwilling to depart. Darkness thinned by degrees, not broken but dissolved, fading into a pallid gray that spread across the fields and rooftops.
Oh.
The mist lay thick, swallowing paths, cloaking trees, veiling the village until its shape seemed ghostly and uncertain. Within the weaver's chamber, the silence was heavy, stretched taut across the air like another warp upon the loom. The loom itself waited. Dark and vast, its frame looming in shadow, stood not merely as wood and thread but as a presence, silent and eternal. Its strings, though stilled through the night, seemed yet to hum faintly with the memory of labor, as though the rhythm lingered in the very air around them. The chamber was its domain, and the woman within it its servant, bound by years beyond reckoning. Upon the narrow cot, the weaver stirred. She did not wake all at once, but slowly, her eyes opening to the dimness, her breath long and shallow. She lay for a time unmoving, listening to the silence, until at last she rose, her joints aching, her bones groaning. She sat upright, hands folded upon her knees, her gaze fixed upon the dark bulk of the loom, which seemed to wait for her with patient gravity. She washed, as she always did, splashing water across her lined face, drinking in slow, measured sips. The bread she broke was dry and hard, yet she chewed it with patience, swallowing without complaint. The act was without thought, part of the rhythm. It's essential and as unchanging as the loom itself. At last she crossed the chamber and took her place. Her hands rested upon the wood, her feet upon the treadles. For a moment she sat still, as though in reverence. And then she pressed. The silence broke. Creak, glide, strike. The loom awakened, its song filling the chamber, steady, unchanging. The shuttle darted, the warp parted, the beater fell. Again, and again, the sound carried a rhythm without end. It was the same as the day before, and the day before that, and all the days that lay behind. It would be the same tomorrow, and the day after, until her hands could move no longer. Outside, the mist-shrouded village began to stir. Faint voices drifted, the cry of a child, the call of a woman to her animals, the bark of a dog, the creak of cartwheels upon wet earth. Yet these sounds reached her only dimly, muffled and fleeting, absorbed into the greater silence. Within her chamber, there was only the loom's voice, eternal and unbroken. The morning deepened, light filtered through the mist, slipping through, the shutters in narrow shafts, striking across the floor. Within those beams, dust and threads floated, pale motes turning like stars in slow, unending circles. They settled upon her garments, her hair, her skin, and she did not brush them away. They belonged to her as she belonged to them. Her hands moved without falter, her feet pressed the treadles, her breath kept time with the rhythm. She could have woven blind, for the work was deeper than sight, carved into her flesh and bone, older than thought. The church bell tolled, heavy and low, its voice carrying across mist and field. It entered the chamber, vibrating within the wood. Of the loom, Weaver bowed her head slightly, though no prayer passed her lips. Her devotion was already given, each strike of the beater, each line of thread. The loom was her altar, the cloth her scripture, the silence her hymn. Hours stretched, though she counted them not. At last she rose, moving slowly to the hearth. She coaxed fire from the ashes, fed it with twigs until smoke curled into the rafters. Into a pot, she poured a measure of peas, hard and dry, filled it with water, and set it upon the flame. Sat waiting as the water boiled, as the peas softened, her gaze fixed upon the rising steam. When it was done, she ate, spoon by spoon, chewing slowly, swallowing without haste. She ate not for pleasure, but for need, as she wove not for glory, but for continuation. She rinsed the pot, set it aside, and returned to the loom. Once more the rhythm began, steady and tireless. Outside, the day brightened, though the mist lingered and the chamber remained dim. The weaver did not look outward. Her eyes stayed upon the threads, upon the shuttle's flight, upon the cloth that grew line by line. Her thoughts wandered. She remembered the past, though dimly, as if through fog. She remembered her mother's voice, soft and patient, guiding. Her hands upon the shuttle. She remembered her father's stern instruction, his insistence upon patience, upon endurance. She remembered her husband's laughter, warm and fleeting, his presence beside her at the loom. She remembered children, their small feet upon the floor, their curious eyes watching the frame. All of it was gone, yet it lingered still, woven into memory, bound into the cloth itself. The afternoon passed. The bell tolled again, deep and solemn, marking the slow approach of evening. The weaver lifted her head, gazing upon the cloth, upon the beam. It was thick now, heavy, pressing against the frame. She touched it lightly, tracing its surface with her fingers. Plain, unadorned, without pattern, yet strong, enduring a record. Of her hours, her days, her life. Others would use it without knowing, without remembering. It would not see her in it, would not hear her silence. Yet still she remained there, hidden within the threads, unseen but eternal. Dusk fell, shadows lengthened. She gathered the cloth, binding it with cord, setting it among the others leaning against the wall. They stood in silent ranks, mute testimony 2 years uncounted, their weight pressing against the stones. She lit a candle, its flame trembling, casting long shadows across the chamber. Once more she returned to her seat, though her arms ached, though her back bent low. The loom answered her still, its cadence steady, its song unyielding. Outside the village hushed. Voices faded, footsteps ceased, smoke rose from hearths. Birds gave their final calls. The air grew heavy with dew. The world darkened into silence. Within, the loom continued, its voice joined by crickets, by the sigh of wind, by the faint cry of an owl. The candle flickered, shadows leaping across the walls like restless spirits. At last her strength waned. She set the shuttle aside, rested. Her hands upon her knees, her breath heavy. She sat long in silence, her eyes upon the half-woven cloth. She thought not of tomorrow, nor of yesterday, only of continuation. The loom would wait. The cloth would grow. Her life was no more than thread drawn into silence. Asterisk, she drew her blanket about her shoulders, lay upon her cot, closed her eyes. The loom's shadow stretched across her, vast and patient. The candle dwindled, smoke rising thinly into the rafters. Darkness closed upon the chamber, deep and silent. Yet still, in that silence, the rhythm endured, unseen, eternal, waiting for dawn to summon it again. The days passed as threads upon the shuttle, each following the other without pause, until they were no longer counted. Dawn returned after night, and night returned after dawn. And in the chamber the rhythm endured, unbroken, steady as the breath of the earth. The loom stood always in its place, vast and unchanging, its wooden frame darkened by years, its strings taut with the weight of labor. The weaver rose from her narrow cot as she had always risen, stiff with age, her joints groaning like the timber of the loom itself. And she washed her face in the basin, drank water from the clay cup, chewed the bread that crumbled dry upon her tongue. Her eyes, dim with years, turned to the loom, and her body moved toward it without thought, drawn by habit older than memory. She pressed the treadle, and the silence broke, the creak of wood filling the chamber, the shuttle gliding swift, the beater striking firm, again and again, without haste, without end. The rhythm resumed. The season beyond the shutters changed, though she marked it not with words or numbers. Winter came first, creeping through the walls, seeping beneath the thatch, biting at her fingers until they stiffened upon the shuttle. The hearth gave little warmth, the fuel scarce, the fire reluctant. She rose often to coax it into life, bending low to breathe upon the coals, to feed it with twigs, to watch the smoke curl into the rafters. Her breath clouded in the cold air, pale and fleeting, yet the loom still sang, muffled but unbroken. Outside, the fields lay frozen, the river slowed beneath ice, the village hushed. The bell of the church rang heavy through the frost, echoing against silence. Nights were long, the candle burning low, its light trembling upon cloth that grew thick upon the beam. Snow fell without sound, cloaking paths and roofs. Yet within the chamber, the sound of the loom endured, a steady rhythm. Against the hush of winter, when the snow melted and the water dripped from the eaves, spring returned. The earth softened, grass pushed upward, buds swelled upon branches, and birds filled the air with bright cries. Children's voices rose once more in laughter, carried on breezes fresh with rain. Light poured more freely through the shutters, golden and warm, striking beams across the floor where dust and flax motes drifted in endless circles. The weaver's hands, though still worn and lined, moved with steadier strength, drawing new flax that came fresh from the fields, fragrant and pale. The cloth brightened, as though it carried the breath of spring within its threads. Outside, the bell rang clearer, mingling with birdsong, with the hum of bees, with the murmur of plows turning soil. Inside the chamber the rhythm was the same, creak, glide, strike, unchanging. She paused at times to gaze at the shafts of sunlight, to listen to the faint voices beyond, but she returned always to the loom, for there was no calendar in her life but cloth, no season but weaving. Summer followed, heavy with heat. The shutters were opened wide, but the air hung still, thick with the scent of sweat, of warm wood, of dust clinging to skin. Flies drifted lazily, buzzing against the beams, landing upon the cloth, brushed away without thought. Outside, the fields stood tall with grain, golden waves rolling beneath the weight of the sun. Men and women moved among them, scythes flashing, voices calling, the sound of harvest echoing across the meadows. Children splashed in the river, their shrill cries carrying upon the hot wind. The loom's voice grew sharper in the heat, its wood swollen, its creak more piercing, but it endured. The weaver's arms glistened with sweat, her breath heavy, her body weary. But she pressed on, pausing only to drink from the basin where water stood warm and stale. Bread softened in broth was her meal, swallowed quickly before her hands returned to the shuttle. The cloth grew thick and strong, heavy upon the beam, and at night, though the candle bent in the heat, though crickets sang endlessly outside, the rhythm of the loom continued, mingling with the chorus of summer. Then the air cooled, and the leaves turned from green to gold, from gold to brown, from brown to ash. Autumn lay its hand upon the fields, stripping them bare, leaving stubble gray beneath the sky. The bell rang heavy, its voice solemn, echoing across air sharp with the scent of wood smoke, of earth turned once more by plow. The chamber darkened. Earlier each day, shadows creeping long across the floor, the candle lit sooner, its flame trembling in the draught. The weaver's hands moved still, though slower, though heavier, the cloth growing as steady as the passing days. Outside, the village gave voice to harvest's end, 2 feasts, 2 songs sung low, 2 prayers for the winter's approach. But within the chamber, the sound was the same. Creak, glide, strike, steady as always, prayer enough for all seasons. And so the wheel turned again, winter returning with its frost, its silence, its long nights and heavy bell. Snow fell once more, the hearth glowed faintly, the weaver's breath hung white in the air. Spring followed with its rain and buds, summer with its heat and harvest, autumn with its falling leaves. And each season passed through the chamber, like a shadow, leaving no trace but the cloth that grew, bound and stacked against the wall. Each season pressed itself unseen into the fabric, each season woven into the threads, though no eye could tell. The loom marked them all, its rhythm unbroken, its voice eternal. The weaver did not count them, did not name them, for they passed. As dreams pass, one into another, without end, time stretched, seamless as the cloth itself. The seasons circled, the years turned, the loom endured, and the weaver endured with it. The years passed unseen, threads without number, slipping one into another until they could no longer be told apart. The chamber remained the same, narrow and dim, its walls darkened by smoke and time. its air heavy with the mingled scents of flax, of wool, of ashes long extinguished. The loom stood always in its place, vast and silent when stilled, vast and living when woken. Its wooden frame scarred by years, its strings humming with the memory of labor, it had become the measure of her life, her companion, her altar, her burden, her breath. The weaver had grown older, though she did not mark her years. Her hair had thinned and whitened, her back had bent lower, her hands had grown more gnarled, her eyes more clouded. Yet still she rose from her cot each morning, stiff with age, her bones groaning like timbers in the wind.
Ow!
Basin, the water cold upon her skin, she drank from the clay cup. She chewed bread until it softened in her mouth. Each action was slow, deliberate, without haste, without change. She turned her eyes to the loom, and her body moved toward it, as though drawn not by choice but by necessity, deeper than breath. She sat, pressed the treadle, and the silence broke. Creak, glide, strike. The sound filled the chamber, unbroken, steady, eternal. The shuttle darted, the warp parted, the beater fell. Again and again, the rhythm measured her days, her years. Her very life, her breath followed it. Her heart followed it. Her mind dissolved into it. She had become less herself than an extension of the loom, her flesh its servant, her spirit its shadow. Outside, the seasons turned. Winter to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter once more. The fields froze, thawed, blossomed, withered and froze again. Children grew and changed, voices new replaced voices gone. The bell of the church tolled as it always had, marking hours she no longer counted, ringing across frost, across rain, across heat, across falling leaves. The village moved in its cycles of birth and death, of labor and rest, but within the chamber the rhythm remained unchanged. The loom sang on, and the weaver answered. Her body weakened, her hands trembled upon the shuttle, her arms ached with each strike of the beater. Her back bent so low, she seemed folded into the loom itself. She paused more often, rising with effort to tend the fire, to boil barley, to soften bread and broth. She ate less, she drank less, her strength waned. Yet still she returned, for without the loom there was nothing. It was not duty, not necessity, not choice, but existence itself. To cease weaving would be to cease living, and so she wove. Her thoughts wandered further into memory, though memory itself was frayed, threads tangled and broken. She saw her mother's hands guiding hers, though her mother's face had faded. She heard her father's voice, stern and distant, though the words were gone. She remembered laughter, though she no longer knew whose laughter it was. She remembered children, their small feet upon the floor, though she could no longer name them. All was shadow, dim and fading, yet still present, lingering like faint smoke after fire. She did not seek to hold them. They passed through her mind as clouds pass. Across the sky, leaving no trace but the ache of remembrance. Sometimes in the stillness of night, she thought she heard voices. A child's cry, a man's laugh, a woman's song, faint and far, as though carried by wind from another time. She raised her head, listening, but there was nothing, only the sigh of wind in the thatch, the call of an owl, the whisper of crickets. She lowered her head again, returned to the loom, and the rhythm drowned all else. The cloth grew heavy upon the beam. She touched it with her hands, tracing its surface, feeling its strength, plain, unadorned, without pattern, yet strong, enduring, unyielding. Within it was bound her hours, her days, her years, pressed into form. Others would use it, wear it, sleep upon it, perhaps bury their dead in it, and they would not know her. They would not see her hands, her breath, her silence. Yet still she remained within it, hidden but eternal, woven into every thread. The chamber darkened earlier now. Her candle burned low, its flame trembling, its smoke curling into the rafters. Shadows lengthened, stretched, merged. Her eyes grew dim, her sight failing, yet her hands moved still, guided by memory, by instinct, by rhythm. She could not see the threads, yet she felt them, knew them, as she knew her own breath. The loom had become her sight, her hands, her heart. Nights were long, her sleep broken. She lay upon her cot, her blanket thin, her body cold, her breath shallow. She closed her eyes, yet the rhythm did not cease. In her dreams she wove, in her waking she wove, and she no longer knew the difference. Time had become seamless, without break, without boundary, like the cloth itself. She grew frailer still. Her hands shook, her arms faltered, her breath came heavy. She paused often, resting her head upon the loom, her eyes closing, her body trembling. Yet always she began again. Creak, glide, strike. She whispered nothing, spoke nothing, yet her silence was filled with the sound. The loom was her prayer, her penance, her comfort, her end. Outside, winter returned once more. Snow fell heavy, blanketing the earth, silencing the village. The hearth gave little warmth, the fire small, the wood scarce. Her breath clouded in the air, her fingers stiffened, her body shook with cold. Yet she sat, she pressed the treadle, she drew the shuttle, she struck the beater. The loom sang on, even as her body faltered. At times she felt the weight of darkness pressing closer, the sense of an ending near. She did not fear it nor welcome it. She acknowledged it as she acknowledged the turning of seasons, the tolling of the bell, the growth of cloth. It was another thread, another passage, another continuation. She thought, perhaps, that death itself was but another weaving, the drawing of one life into a greater fabric, unseen but eternal. And so she wove, line by line, hour by hour, year by year. Her life thinned as the candle thins, as the cloth thickened. As the shadows lengthened, the loom endured, and she endured with it, until both were one, inseparable, unbroken. The night deepened. The candle burned low. The weaver sat before the loom, her hands upon the shuttle, her breath slow and faint. The rhythm faltered, slowed, paused, yet began again. Creak, glide, strike, out. She closed her eyes, her body swaying, her head bowed, her breath shallow. The loom loomed above her, vast and patient. Its shadow stretched across the chamber. The candle burned low, its flame bent and flickering, its wax dripping in slow rivulets down the side, hardening into pale ridges like frozen tears. Smoke curled thinly into the rafters, fading into the dark. The chamber was hushed, save for the sound that had lived within it for more years than could be remembered. The groan of wood, the whisper of threads, the thud of the beater, steady and slow. The loom still sang, though its song faltered now. Broken by pauses, softened by weariness, the weaver sat hunched before it, her body bent low, her hair white, her face a map of deep lines carved by time. Her hands trembled upon the shuttle, her arms weakened, her breath heavy. Each motion was slow, uncertain, yet still she pressed, still she drew, still she struck. Creak, glide, strike. The rhythm lived on, though faint, though fragile, though fading. Her eyes, clouded and dim, no longer saw the threads with clarity. They blurred before her, shadows against shadow, yet her fingers knew them still. They traced each line, each knot, each imperfection, with memory older than sight. She could have woven blind, and in truth she did, for her body had become the loom, and the loom had become her body. The distinction was long lost, the boundary long dissolved. The chamber was cold. Winter lay heavy upon the earth, snow piled against the walls, frost creeping across the shutters. Her breath hung in the air, pale clouds rising and vanishing. The hearth glowed faintly, its fire weak, its wood scarce. She fed it when she could, bending low to coax flame from ember, to warm her hands a moment before returning to the frame. But the cold pressed always closer, filling the chamber, sinking into her bones. Outside, the village was hushed. Doors were barred, smoke rose faintly from chimneys. Voices were few. The church bell tolled, slow and heavy, its sound carrying across frozen fields, entering the chamber, vibrating within the wood. She bowed her head as she always had, though her lips did not move. Prayer was no longer in voice, but in thread, in motion, in silence. The loom was her altar, and she remained faithful to the end. Her strength waned further. She rose with difficulty, her steps slow, her breath shallow. At the hearth she boiled barley, stirring the pot with trembling hands, her eyes half closed. She ate little, only enough to continue. She drank from the clay cup, the water cold, sharp against her tongue. Then she returned. Always she returned, for there was nowhere else to go, nothing else to be. She thought often of the past, though the past itself was dim. Memories came as shadows, brief and fading. She saw her mother's hands guiding her. As a child, though her mother's face was lost, she heard her father's voice, stern and distant, though the words were gone. She felt laughter, warm and fleeting, though she no longer knew whose laughter it was. She remembered children's cries, small feet upon the floor, though she could not recall their names. All was shadow, slipping from her grasp, yet it lingered still, woven into the threads. Bound into the cloth at night, when the candle died, when darkness filled the chamber, she lay upon her cot, her blanket thin, her body cold, her eyes closed. But the rhythm did not cease. In her dreams she wove, in her waking she wove, and she no longer knew the difference. Time was seamless, endless without break, without boundary. It's like the cloth itself. Sometimes, in the deep hours, she thought she heard voices. A child calling, a man laughing, a woman singing faint and far. She raised her head, listening, her breath caught. But there was nothing, only wind in the thatch, the cry of an owl, the whisper of snow against the shutters. She lowered her head again, her hands upon the shuttle, and the rhythm returned. Creak, glide, strike. The cloth upon the beam grew heavy, thick, unyielding. She touched it often, her fingers tracing its surface, feeling its strength. Plain, unadorned, without pattern, yet enduring. It held her hours, her days, her years. Others would use it, wear it, sleep beneath it, bury their dead in it. They would not know her. They would not remember her, yet she would remain within it, silent but eternal, bound into every thread. Her candle dwindled faster now, her woodpile. Lo, her food scarce. She ate less, she drank less. Her body thinned, her breath weakened. Yet she sat always before the loom, her hands moving, her feet pressing, her body swaying with the rhythm. Even when she faltered, even when she paused, she began again. Loom endured, and she endured with it. One night, as the snow fell heavy outside, blanketing the earth in silence, she sat long before the loom, her hands trembling, her eyes closed. The rhythm slowed, faltered, ceased. She leaned forward, her head resting upon the beam, her breath shallow, her body still. For a long moment there was silence, deep and unbroken. Then, slowly, her hands moved once more, lifting the shuttle, pressing the treadle, striking the beater, creak, glide, strike. The rhythm returned, faint but living. She smiled faintly, though no one saw, though no one knew, and her breath continued. The night deepened. The candle flickered, its flame thin, its smoke rising. Shadows stretched across the chamber, merging, dissolving. The weaver sat, her hands upon the loom, her body bent low. Her breath slowed, softened, faded. The rhythm faltered, paused, began. Again, faltered once more. The loom loomed above her, vast and patient. Its shadow stretched across the chamber. The cloth upon the beam hung heavy, unfinished, waiting. The threads were drawn, the shuttle poised, the beater raised. The rhythm trembled upon the edge of silence, wavering between motion and stillness, between life and death. Her eyes closed. Her hands rested. Her breath ceased. The chamber was silent. The loom stood still. The candle died. Smoke curled into darkness. Snow fell outside, heavy and unbroken, cloaking the world in silence. The cloth remained. Plain and enduring, its threads bound tight, its surface smooth. Within it lingered her hours, her days, her years, her breath, her silence, her prayer. She was gone, but she remained woven into every line, every thread. Unseen but eternal, the loom stood, vast and patient, its shadow stretched across the chamber. It waited, as it had always waited, as it would always wait for hands that would not return. The silence deepened, the rhythm ended, yet the memory of it lingered, as though the very air remembered, as though the walls themselves hummed with the ghost of its sound. The chamber stood silent, the loom vast and still, its frame dark against the pale light that crept through the shutters. Dust gathered upon the stool, upon the beam, upon the shuttle that rested idle, its path unfinished. The air hung heavy, filled with the faint scent of flax, of wool, of smoke, long since faded. The cot lay empty, the blanket folded upon itself untouched. The candle had burned to nothing, leaving only a hardened pool of wax upon the table. The days passed, one upon another, without the sound that had filled the chamber for so many years. The rhythm was gone, the creak, the glide, the strike no longer echoed against the walls. The silence grew thick, pressing against the wood, against the stone, until it seemed that even the loom itself mourned. Yet the cloth remained, rolled. Heavy upon the beam, bound tight in cords, its threads plain and unadorned, its strength silent. Within it lingered hours uncounted, years without measure, the breath of a life woven into every line. Outside, the village stirred as it always had. The bell of the church tolled, its sound rolling across the fields, through the lanes, into the air. Children played in the mud, their laughter sharp and bright. Men bent to plow, women drew water from the well, carts rattled upon stones. Within the chamber there was only stillness. The door remained closed, the shutters half drawn, the hearth cold. Shadows lengthened, faded, returned, unbroken by motion. In time, footsteps came. The door creaked, its hinges stiff, and light poured. Into the chamber. A figure entered, young, uncertain, her eyes wide as she looked upon the loom. She touched it lightly, her fingers tracing the worn wood, the grooves carved deep by years of hands. She saw the cloth upon the beam, rolled thick, unfinished, waiting. She drew her hand across it, feeling its strength, its silence, its weight. She did not know whose hands had made it, whose breath was bound within it. Yet she felt something linger, unseen but near. Others came, voices low, steps careful. They looked upon the chamber, upon the loom, upon the bolts of cloth stacked against the wall. They spoke softly, of taking, of using, of selling. They touched the fabric, tested its strength, nodded at its worth. They did not see the years within it, did not hear the silence pressed into its threads. To them, it was cloth, plain and serviceable, nothing more. They carried it away, one bolt after another, until only the unfinished roll remained. The loom stood empty, its beam bare, its shuttle idle. Dust gathered thicker, cobwebs stretched across its frame, the air grew musty with neglect. The chamber was left to silence, to shadows, to the slow creeping of time. Seasons passed outside, winter to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter again, yet within the chamber nothing stirred. The loom waited, vast and patient, for hands that did not return. In time, children dared to enter there. Laughter hushed as they crossed the threshold. They touched the loom, struck it with sticks, pulled at its cords, then fled, their cries echoing through the lane. Dust rose in their wake, settling again upon the wood. The loom endured, scarred and silent, its shadow long against the wall. Years turned. Roofs were mended, walls rebuilt, faces changed. The chamber remained, though its thatch sagged, its shutters loosened, its stones cracked. Rain dripped through the roof, dampening the floor, staining the wood. Mice scurried in corners. Spiders wove their webs between the beams. The cot rotted, the blanket crumbled, the table warped. Yet still the loom stood, dark and immense, its presence unbroken. At last another came, older now, her hair dark but streaked with gray. She stepped into the chamber, her eyes drawn at once to the loom. She touched it with reverence, her fingers brushing the dust, the cobwebs, the wood. She sat upon the stool, pressed the treadle, listened to the creak. She lifted the shuttle, though no thread was wound, and passed it through the empty warp. The sound returned, faint, broken, but living. Creak, glide, strike. The rhythm trembled in the chamber once more, as though awakened from long sleep. She rose then, her eyes thoughtful, her breath steady. She spoke softly, of repairing, of using, of weaving again. Others followed, bringing flax, bringing wool, bringing thread. They cleaned the chamber, swept the floor, mended the roof. They set fire in the hearth, lighted candles, filled the air with smoke and warmth once more. The loom was tended, its cords replaced, its frame tightened, its wood rubbed with oil. It stood renewed, though still scarred by years. Still heavy with memory, hands young and eager took the shuttle, pressed the treadle, struck the beater. The rhythm began again, uneven at first, clumsy, uncertain, but growing steadier with each day. Creak, glide, strike. The sound filled the chamber once more, echoing against the walls, humming within the beams. The cloth grew again upon the beam, bright and new, plain but strong. Voices mingled with it now, laughter, conversation, song. But beneath them all, the rhythm remained, steady, unchanging, eternal, and though the weaver was gone, though her breath no longer rose in the chamber, something of her lingered still. In the silence between sounds, in the shadow of the loom, in the threads themselves, unseen but present. The new hands did not know her, did not remember her, yet they carried her rhythm, her silence, her devotion. The loom endured, the cloth endured, and within them she endured also, woven into time, hidden but eternal. The bolts of cloth were carried from the chamber, stacked upon carts, their cords bound tight, their weight heavy. The loom stood behind, in silence, vast and patient, but the fabric itself began its wandering. Across the lanes of the village, the cart rolled, its wheels groaning, its load shifting, the cloth swaying with each turn. Children ran beside it, laughing, their hands reaching to touch the rough bundles. Their voices sharp against the hush of morning. Dogs barked, hens scattered, doors opened as faces peered out to watch. The cloth moved slowly, steadily, toward the market. The market was loud, filled with the cries of sellers, the clamor of buyers, the sound of animals driven through the lanes. Stalls of wood stood crowded, their tables laid with goods, pots of clay, knives of iron, baskets of rushes, jars of honey, skins of leather and cloth. The bolts were laid out, plain and heavy, their cords untied, their length unrolled before. The eyes of strangers, hands reached to touch, fingers pressed against the weave, voices spoke of price, of strength, of use. No one saw the years within it. The silence pressed into each thread, the breath bound into every line. They saw only cloth, strong and serviceable, fit for labor, fit for life. One piece was taken first, cut with a knife, measured against an arm. Coins clinked into a hand, and the cloth was folded, carried away. A woman bore it home, her steps quick, her face lined with labor. She laid it upon a table, spread it flat, cut it again, stitched it with coarse thread. It became a garment, plain and simple, worn upon her back as she bent to her work in the field, as she drew water from the well, as she carried wood upon her shoulders. Sweat darkened it, rain soaked it, wind whipped it, sun faded it, yet still it endured, holding fast, unyielding. Its threads bound tight as they had been woven. Another piece was bought, carried by a man whose beard was gray, his voice low. He spread it upon a bed, laying straw beneath, smoothing the fabric. With his hands, at night he lay upon it, his body heavy with age, his breath rough with weariness. His wife lay beside him, her hands folded upon her chest, her eyes closed in sleep. The cloth bore their weight, their warmth, their silence, through night after night, season after season. Children clambered upon it, their feet pressing it down. Their laughter ringing in the dim light of the fire. It grew worn, frayed at the edges, patched with care, but it endured. carrying within it the echo of lives unseen by those who had woven it. Another length was taken to the church, carried in. Solemn procession, laid upon a coffin, plain wood borne upon shoulders, the cloth draped heavy, its folds dark in the candlelight, its weight pressing down upon the silence of mourning. Voices murmured prayers, the bell tolled, the earth opened, and the body was lowered. The cloth was lifted, folded, carried away. Used again and again, each time a shroud, each time a witness to grief, each time a silent bearer of finality. It absorbed the weight of tears, the touch of hands, sound of earth falling upon wood, until its threads seemed heavy with sorrow. Asterisk, other pieces found other lives. One was cut into sacks filled with grain, carried upon shoulders, laid upon. Carts, emptied into bins, filled again. It smelled of earth, of barley, of rye, of dust. It rubbed against stone, against wood, against hands calloused with labor. It tore, was stitched, tore again, was mended, and still it served. Cut into a cloth for the table, spread each evening, upon which bread was laid, upon which cups were set, upon which hands rested. Children smeared it with broth. Men wiped their mouths upon it. Women folded it carefully each night. It grew stained, worn thin, yet it endured, holding fast the daily silence of life. The years passed. The cloth wore thin, its edges frayed. Its surface patched again and again. Yet even as it faded, even as it weakened, it endured, was handed from one to another, from parent to child, from old to young. Its use changed. Its form altered, but its threads remained, and within them, unseen, unheard, lingered the silence of the weaver, the rhythm of the loom, the breath of years long gone. The loom still stood in the chamber, though few entered now. Dust gathered thick upon it, cobwebs stretched across its frame, the air heavy with dampness. The roof sagged, the shutters warped, the hearth cold. Mice scurried, spiders wove, rain dripped, yet the loom endured, vast and patient, waiting. Shadow stretched across the floor, its presence heavy, as though it still remembered the rhythm that once filled it. The sound of creak, glide, strike. Children whispered of the chamber, of the loom that stood silent, of the woman who had woven until her breath ceased. They dared one another to enter, their laughter sharp, their fear deeper. Back. They touched the wood, struck it, fled, their cries echoing through the lanes. Yet still the loom stood, vast and patient, unmoved. It waited, as it had always waited, for hands that might return, and the cloth wandered still, across tables, across beds, across fields, across graves. It bore the weight of labor, of sleep, of sorrow, of silence. It frayed, it tore, it was patched, it was mended, it was changed. Yet within it lingered what none could see, the breath of the weaver, the prayer of her silence, the rhythm of her days. The loom was empty. The chamber hushed, but the cloth remained, moving through life, enduring beyond her death. She was gone. Yet she was present, woven into the fabric of the world, hidden but eternal, silent but unyielding. The cloth passed from hand to hand, from chest to chest, folded and unfolded, cut and mended, until its first shape was forgotten. A garment once worn in the field grew thin at the shoulders, torn at the hem, patched with new fabric, and worn again until the threads gave way, till it was cut smaller, made into cloth for a child, then torn again, turned to rags, dipped in. Water scrubbed against wood, stained with earth, left to dry in wind. What had once borne the weight of toil beneath the sun now bore the silence of corners, the hidden labor of cleaning, the damp smell of soap and soil. The threads frayed, yet still they endured. Still they held the breath of years long vanished. Upon another bed in another house, the length once spread smooth began to sag, its surface worn by bodies that had grown older, heavier, slower. The fabric grew thin, where shoulders pressed, where feet rubbed, where restless sleep pulled at its edges. Children played upon it, spilling broth, scattering crumbs, laughing, then sleeping deeply in the hollow warmth. Their parents whispered, their voices low in the dark, and the cloth heard all, bore all, carried all, though none knew it. At last it was lifted, folded, set aside, replaced by newer, brighter fabric. But it remained in a chest, hidden beneath other things, forgotten but not gone. Another length, once draped across the coffin of the old, was kept for many years in the vestry of the church. Folded carefully, its edges marked by candle wax, its surface darkened by hands, it was used again and again. Laid over wood, carried above earth, folded back as the bell tolled, as the ground opened, as prayers rose. Each body was different, each face vanished, but the cloth remained. The same folds falling across sorrow after sorrow, until its threads grew heavy with grief, until the very touch of it seemed laden with silence. And when at last it frayed, too much, when its edges fell apart, it was torn, cut into strips, used to polish chalices, to wipe the altar, to bind candles in bundles. Its solemn weight was forgotten, but still its fibers held the shadows of tears, pressed deep within them. Seasons turned, years passed, roofs sank, walls leaned, paths shifted. The village grew and shrank. Children became old, old became earth, new faces replaced the vanished. Yet still, in corners, in chests, in barns, pieces of the old cloth lingered. One sack, patched with remnants, carried grain until it split, then was stitched, then carried again until it split once more. It was cut into smaller pieces, tied about tools, stuffed into cracks to keep out wind, left at last in a pile of rags. Another rag cut from a sleeve was used to bandage wounds, to tie about a bleeding hand, to wrap a broken arm, to absorb the red that stained and dried within its weave. When washed, the stain remained, pale but present, a memory held though. None wished it. The years wore them thinner, until fibers broke, until patches frayed, until nothing remained whole. Some were thrown upon fires, their smoke rising into the rafters, their ash scattering into earth. Others were left in heaps, damp with rain, chewed by mice, torn by birds for their nests. Threads came loose, caught upon wind, carried across. Fields settled in grass, in mud, in the cracks of stones. Small fibers, almost unseen, drifted into water, floated down the river, sank into silt. The cloth dissolved into fragments, into remnants, into nothing. Yet even in nothing, something lingered, a silence, a weight. A memory pressed into the world. The loom still stood in the chamber, though the chamber itself grew weaker. The roof sagged further, the shutters hung loose, the stones crumbled. Dripped through, soaking wood, darkening the earth. Weeds pushed through cracks, spiders spread their webs, birds nested in the eaves. The hearth was cold, its stones broken, its ash scattered long ago. The cot was gone, the table rotted, the stool fallen. Only the loom remained, vast and dark, its frame scarred, its cords broken, its shuttle lost. Dust lay thick upon it, cobwebs clung, shadows covered, yet it stood as though still waiting, as though still listening, as though still remembering. Children no longer entered, for the chamber had grown strange, its air heavy, its silence deep. They whispered of it as they passed, glancing at its door, hurrying their steps. They said the loom was haunted, that at night it groaned, that in silence it spoke. Some swore they had heard the sound faintly, creak, glide, strike, though no hands touched it. Others said they had seen a shadow bent before it, white hair, thin hands, eyes that glimmered in the dark. They fled when they dared approach, their laughter sharp with fear, their footsteps quick, and still the threads wandered. A scrap patched a shoe worn upon muddy roads, soaking in rain, stiffening in frost. Another tied a bundle, carried across. Fields left upon a shelf, forgotten. Another wiped a child's face, another caught the sweat of a brow, another lined the bottom of a chest. Piece by piece they thinned, they faded, they vanished. Yet within them all lingered the rhythm, the silence, the prayer. Generations passed. The memory of the weaver dimmed, her name forgotten, her life dissolved into dust. The cloth she had woven was gone, burned, rotted, scattered. The loom leaned, broken, its wood splintered, its frame sinking into earth. The chamber crumbled, its stones falling, its roof collapsing, its walls overtaken by ivy. Birds sang in its ruins, foxes crept through, moss spread across its floor. Rain fell, snow lay, sun warmed, and still the remnants faded. Yet somewhere, in the cracks of earth, in the silt of rivers, in the dust that drifted upon air, small fibers remained, unseen, unnoticed, but present. They clung to roots, to stones, to soil. They mingled with earth, with water, with air. They were no longer cloth, no longer thread, but dust, but breath, but silence. And within them lingered still the faintest echo, as though the world itself remembered, as though time itself had been marked by the rhythm once pressed into them. The chamber was gone, its stones scattered, its timbers rotted, its thatch long devoured by wind and rain. The loom was gone, its frame broken, its cords snapped, its wood sunken into earth. Its cloth was gone, its threads burned, torn, scattered, dissolved into dust. Nothing remained of the weaver's hands, nothing of her breath, nothing of her silence. Yet still the village spoke of her. Children whispered as they passed the place where her house had once stood. Now no more than a hollow of stones half buried in grass, nettles thick, ivy creeping. They said it was haunted, that at night a light glimmered faintly, that a shadow bent before an unseen frame, that a sound drifted into the dark air, faint but steady. Creak, glide, strike. They laughed as they told it, but their eyes turned quickly away, and their steps hastened. Old men spoke of her when the fire burned low. Their voices hushed, their eyes fixed upon the flames. They said she had woven from dawn to dusk, from youth to death, never ceasing, never faltering. They said she had woven prayers into cloth, silence into thread, time itself into fabric. They said her breath lingered in the garments of the old, in the cloths upon tables, in the shrouds upon the dead. They said she was not gone, that she lived still in the weave of the world. Unseen but eternal, women spoke of her when they bent to their own looms, their feet pressing treadles, their hands guiding shuttles. They remembered hearing of her from their mothers, who had heard from their mothers before them. They said she had sat until her hair grew white, until her hands shook, until her breath ceased, yet still she wove. They said the loom itself had mourned when she was gone, standing silent, waiting, patient, until it too fell into ruin. They said no one could weave as she had woven, for she had given not only thread, but life, but silence, but prayer. The bell of the church tolled as it always had, sound carrying across fields, through lanes, into hearts. The people heard it and thought, though they did not say, of the weaver who had bowed her head with every toll, whose prayer had been her labor, whose devotion had been her silence. The sound of the bell was the sound of her loom, the rhythm of her days, the echo of her life. The years turned, seasons circled, children became old, old became earth, new faces replaced the vanished. Yet still the tale endured, carried from tongue to tongue, from fire to fire, from loom to loom. It grew dim, altered, adorned, yet its core remained. The weaver, the loom, the endless cloth, the silence that was prayer. Some said she had woven a cloth so long it wrapped the village itself, protecting it from hunger, from sorrow, from death. Some said she had woven until she vanished, until she became thread, until she was cloth. Some said she had woven time itself, and that all their days were but her fabric. Children listened wide-eyed, their breaths caught, their hearts quickened. They asked if she would return, if she still wove in the dark, if the sound they heard at night was hers. The old shook their heads, their voices low, their eyes shadowed. She was gone, they said, but she was present. She was dust, but she was thread. She was silence, but she was prayer. And so the story lived, long after the chamber had crumbled, long after the loom had rotted, long after the cloth had vanished. It lived in words, in whispers, in shadows. It lived in the creak of wood, in the toll of the bell, in the hum of looms, still worked by hands that did not know her, yet carried her rhythm. It lived in the silence between sounds, in the stillness of night, in the breath that rose and faded, and though none had seen her, though none remembered her face, though her name was lost, still, if one listened in the hush of evening, if one stood by the ruins, if one bowed low in silence, faintly, faintly, there seemed yet to be a sound. Centuries passed, the village changed, the lanes widened. Roofs rose and fell, stones were lifted, paths shifted. The place where the chamber had stood grew over with grass, nettles thick, ivy creeping, until no mark remained. New houses were raised, new fields plowed, new faces lived, old faces vanished. Yet still the tale endured, carried in whispers, told at night, murmured by fire. The children of children heard of the weaver, though they no longer knew her house. Though they no longer knew her loom, they spoke of her as one speaks of shadows, of spirits, of those who linger unseen. They said she had woven time, that their days were her threads, that their lives were her fabric. They said the world itself was her cloth, plain and strong, enduring. Travelers came, strangers passing, their eyes upon the market, their hands upon coin. They heard the whispers, they asked of the weaver. The villagers spoke softly, their voices low, their eyes turning to the ground. They said she was gone, yet she was present. They said she was dust, yet she was thread. They said if one stood in silence by the old stones, if one listened in the hush of night, one might hear her still. The strangers laughed, or wondered, or shook their heads. But when night came, and the wind moved through the lanes, they too thought they heard it. Creak, glide, strike. The centuries deepened. The church was rebuilt, its stones larger, its tower higher, its bell heavier. The market grew, stalls multiplied, carts crowded the lanes. The village became a town, its walls thick, its gates strong. Yet within the town the old tale remained, passed in whispers, told in shadows. The loom was no longer remembered in wood, nor the chamber in stone, but in story. It became less a memory than a legend, less a woman than a spirit, less a life than a symbol. They said she had never died, but had woven herself into the cloth of time. They said she sat still in a hidden chamber, unseen by any, her hands white, her hair long, her eyes dim, her shuttle moving still. They said the seasons were her weaving, winter the pale thread, spring the green, summer the gold, autumn the brown. They said death itself was her cloth, that each life was a thread she drew, that each end was the strike of her beater. They said the world was her loom, vast and unyielding, its rhythm eternal. The town grew larger still, streets paved, walls expanded, towers raised. New voices filled its lanes, new tongues spoke, new faces passed. The old stories dimmed their words, fading, their meaning lost. Yet still, in corners, in alleys, in hushed voices, the weaver was remembered. Old women spoke of her two children, their eyes distant, their voices low. They said the sound of the loom was the sound of the bell, the sound of the wheel, the sound of the heart. They said if one sat in silence, if one closed one's eyes, one might hear her still. Children listened wide, their breaths caught, their hearts quickened. They dared each other to seek her in the ruins, though no ruins remained.
They ran.
2 fields, 2 old stones, 2 shadowed lanes, and they listened. Some swore they heard it, faint but clear, the sound of wood upon wood, creak, glide, strike. Others laughed, others doubted, but the story remained, and it endured. The centuries rolled on. The town became a city, its streets crowded, its markets vast, its towers high. Stone replaced wood, iron replaced stone, light filled the night. Noise filled the air. The loom was forgotten by most, its tale dimmed, its name lost. It still, in some hidden places, in some hushed voices, it endured. They said she had woven the past, that all that had been was her fabric. They said she wove still, though none could see her, though none could hear her, save in dreams, save in silence. They said the sound of the loom was the sound of time, that the creak was the past, the glide the present, the strike the future. They said the world was her cloth, and they were but threads within it, plain and small, yet bound into the whole. Travelers passed through, scholars wrote, monks copied, poets sang. Some heard the tale, some wrote it down, some adorned it, some altered it. The weaver became myth, became symbol, became shadow. She was no longer a woman in a chamber, but a figure of eternity, a hand unseen, a voice unheard. Yet still, within the silence, her rhythm endured. Generations became centuries, centuries became ages. The loom was gone, the cloth was gone, the chamber was gone, the village was gone. The city that had risen fell, its walls broken, its streets empty, its stones scattered. Grass grew, trees rose, rivers shifted, mountains crumbled. Time devoured all, yet still the tale lingered. It was told in fragments, in whispers, in ruins. A stone marked the place, carved with lines none remembered. None could read. Travelers passed, paused, wondered, moved on. The wind sighed through grass, the river murmured, the earth breathed. And in the silence, faintly, faintly, there seemed still to be a sound. The tale stretched further, beyond people, beyond villages, beyond cities. It became the story of time itself, the rhythm of stars, the weaving of worlds. The seasons were her warp, the years her weft, the centuries her beam. Galaxies spun as her shuttle, suns burned as her candles, darkness fell as her night. Her loom, vast and eternal, unbroken, unyielding. The universe was her cloth, plain but strong, woven with silence, with breath, with prayer. And though she was gone, though her chamber was dust, though her loom was ashes, she endured still, woven into all. She was the thread of time, the rhythm of existence, the silence between sounds. She was dust, she was cloth, she was breath, she was prayer. She was gone, she was eternal, and if one stood in silence, if one listened in stillness, if one bowed, lo, before the vastness of night, faintly, faintly, there was a sound.